Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dolly Duffy, the Executive Director of your Alumni Association and a member of the, thank you. And a member of the class of 1984. So I'm celebrating my 35th reunion. Thanks so much for coming to the Father Ted Said Speaker Series. But before we get started, I would be really remiss if I didn't remind you that you'll have an opportunity to see the entire Hesburgh documentary tonight, beginning at 9 o'clock at the Leighton Concert Hall in DeBartolo. Tickets are free, and they'll begin distributing them at 8 o'clock. And the director, Patrick Creedon, who's a member of the class of 1989, only his 30th, will be on hand to introduce the film, and it ties perfectly to the theme of this afternoon's speaker series. This is one of the new events at Reunion that we're really excited about. The idea is relatively simple. We choose a topic that Father Ted was passionate about, and we know he had great passion about a lot of different things. And then we bring in experts from the Notre Dame family to deliver brief talks, almost like TED Talks, but Father Ted Talks, on different aspects of that topic. It began last year with a series of presentations on peacebuilding and security, and this is year 2. The premise is pretty straightforward, but I got to tell you, the speakers we've assembled today are absolutely exceptional. Our topic is civil and human rights, and our faculty members and alumni will speak from true experiences and real life experiences that they've had. Before we begin, I want to let you know that I won't be coming up at the end. My colleague, Mike Sullivan from the class of 1990, will be the one to come up and close, because I'm going to head over and get ready for that 4 o'clock mass. I hope you'll all join us. To introduce our speakers, I want to bring up our host for this event, Jennifer Mason McAward. She's celebrating Reunion this year with her classmates from the class of 1994. She's the director of the Klaus Center. Did I hear a little cheer for her? Please, go do it. She's the director of the Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights. She's also an associate professor of law and has been a faculty member here at Notre Dame since 2005. She received her JD summa cum laude from New York University School of Law in 1998. Among her research areas, Jennifer has studied the United States Commission on Civil Rights and explored the role that Father Ted played in advancing civil rights. But before I bring her up, I also just want to give her a warm personal thank you, because she's an incredible partner with the Alumni Association and one of those people that always goes to yes first when you ask her. She's the mother of 4 children, and she's just a real dynamo. So help me welcome Jennifer Mason McAward.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming this afternoon. As Dolly said, this is my 25th reunion, class of 94. I never would have dreamed 25 years ago that I'd find my vocation teaching at Notre Dame. And 14 years ago, when I joined the faculty, I never would have dreamed that I'd get to know Father Ted. But during my first semester teaching civil rights law, one of my students came and asked me whether I'd be willing to bring the class to meet Father Ted, who is renowned for his civil rights leadership. I was too scared to call his office. I put it off for weeks. I finally screwed up my courage, and he graciously accepted, and that became the first annual civil rights law pilgrimage to Father Ted's office. When the class would arrive, he would personally greet each student, shaking their hand and asking where they were from, and then he'd settle into his armchair, and uniformly, every year, he'd begin by invoking the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women, Father Ted added, are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, Father Ted said, it sounded good on paper, but our country didn't live up to the promise of its founding. We created a separate set of rules, expectations, and opportunities that were based on the color of a person's skin. But, Father Ted said, I had a chance to help change that. And he went on to tell the students about his service on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, an independent commission appointed by the president. Father Ted was appointed in 1959 and served for 14 years. And by all accounts, he distinguished himself as a really savvy policymaker, but also as a moral leader who brought clarity to the fight against racism. And the story Father Ted told my students was riveting. It involved ordinary people he met who had been oppressed all their lives, who endured threats when they told people that they would testify before the U.S. Commission. And these people showed up to tell their stories, and it included people like a U.S. Army captain who was denied the right to vote in his home state of Louisiana. It involved a mother who, while giving her 6-year-old son a bath, had him ask her, "If I scrub hard enough, will I become white?" Witnesses like these detailed the ways in which their ability to vote, their choice of a job and a home, and their education were systematically constrained by the color of their skin. So Father Ted talked about ordinary people, and he talked about presidents. President Eisenhower, who created the commission and appointed Father Ted. President Kennedy, who did his very best to ignore the commission. And President Johnson, who took the commission's recommendations and signed them into law. And Father Ted talked about the civil rights commissioners themselves. 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 1 independent Catholic priest from Indiana, who understood that racism was not just a betrayal of our founding promise, but also an affront to God-given human dignity. These commissioners listened to the witnesses who came before them. They listened to each other and their different political views and personal experiences, and they came together with Father Ted's leadership to draft the framework of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which dismantled Jim Crow. Father Ted served on the Civil Rights Commission until 1973, and in that year he was chair of the commission, and he decided to publish a report that was critical of the Nixon administration's record on civil rights. President Nixon promptly fired Father Ted, and he wore that as a badge of pride. Father Ted returned to Notre Dame convinced that Notre Dame should provide intellectual leadership to advance both civil rights at home and human rights around the globe. And indeed, as a Catholic university that prizes the dignity of the human person, whose mission calls each one of us to solidarity and concern for the common good, Notre Dame should be the place for scholarship, leadership, and engagement on questions of civil and human rights. And so, Father Ted founded what is now the Klau Center for Civil and Human Rights. It is a privilege and awesome responsibility for me as the director of the Klau Center to inherit Father Ted's civil rights legacy and vision, and try to build and deepen the university's academic efforts on these issues. The Klaus Center is part of the new Keough School of Global Affairs, and it's in the process of building a community of students and faculty who are highly engaged with questions of civil and human rights. We're creating new academic programs. Civil and human rights are not just a question of law. We are engaging with political scientists, sociologists, theologians, historians, even engineers, to deepen our understanding of the why and the how of human dignity. We're supporting student internships over the summer with civil and human rights organizations. We've just launched an initiative called With Voices True, which is an effort to collect and archive reflections of our Notre Dame community, students, staff, faculty, alumni, on the topic of race. And we're bringing some remarkable speakers to campus. This past year, for example, we welcomed a man named Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent 30 years on Alabama's death row for a crime he did not commit, who was told by police that it didn't matter whether he was innocent because he was black, and that was enough to get him convicted. "I'm a broken man," he told our students, "and the only way we can fix our broken criminal justice system is through you," he said. The Klaus Center is working to engage Notre Dame's students and faculty on the critically important issues of our times. The Klaus Center, however, is only one part of Father Ted's legacy of fighting for civil rights and human dignity. Father Ted's example of moral leadership has taken root at Notre Dame and has borne fruit in some truly remarkable alumni and faculty. We're here today to learn from and be inspired by some of these members of our Notre Dame community. The first speaker you're going to hear from is Sonny Herford, class of '79, who's a senior systems engineer and also at age 6 was the first African-American child to integrate the public schools in Huntsville, Alabama. He'll share his reflections on inequality. Next, Diane Pender Hughes, Notre Dame Presidential Faculty Fellow, Chair and Professor of the Department of Africana Studies, and Professor of Political Science. Her research focuses on racial and ethnic politics in the United States, and she'll talk to us today about her work on voting rights. After that, Mary Meg McCarthy, class of 1980, Executive Director of the National Immigrant Justice Center, who will talk about her advocacy for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Next, Dr. David Gauss, class of '84, who co-founded with Father Ted and is now the Executive Director of Andean Health and Development in rural Ecuador. He'll talk about his advocacy for quality health care for the poor. And finally, Professor David Anderson Hooker, Associate Professor of the Practice of Conflict Transformation and Peacebuilding. He'll share his experience working with the Chicago Torture Justice Center to heal communities affected by police violence. So thank you to each one of you for being here. I know you're going to enjoy and be challenged by the things that we hear today. And thank you, Father Ted, who I am sure is looking down, for helping to inspire future generations of civil and human rights leaders. Enjoy our time together.
Like holding a man underwater and saying, why don't you swim? It's pretty hard to swim if you're being held underwater, or it's shackling a fellow to a post and saying, why don't you run? In other words, we have created a kind of social situation where discrimination bears upon a person because of his color 1,000 times a day. He can't do this, he can't do that. He's lacked many things that we take for granted, or our youngsters take for granted. And therefore, you cannot put all these inhibitions around a person and then say, why don't you try harder? What we have to do is create what this country has stood for everyone, is equality of opportunity. Now, what happens after that, of course, is an individual's own personal responsibility, but not to have equality of opportunity, then to blame someone for not performing better is putting the cart before the horse.
Please welcome engineer and civil rights activist Sonny Herford from the class of 1979.
Good afternoon. Anybody else here from the class of '79? A few of us? Okay, wonderful. Well, Father Ted worked for decades on human rights issues, including civil rights issues. He understood that some members of society face challenges that are not necessarily faced by all members of society. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama, where we have Redstone Arsenal and NASA George C. Marshall Space Flight Center for NASA. So, of course, we have a lot of federal contracts there. And one of the discussions I've had with a lot of my coworkers and friends over the years is about set-asides for minorities, and or quotas for minorities. And what Father Ted understood was that some members of our society are at a disadvantage as a direct result of the actions of the federal government, and therefore the federal government has tried to do some things to make those right. Okay. As far as my own story goes, that's me, the little guy there. When I was 6 years old, I was the first black child to integrate the schools in the state of Alabama in 1963. Now, my father actually had to file a lawsuit to get me to be able to go to the all-white school that was about a block and a half from our home. The all-black school for the city of Huntsville was about 1.5 miles from our home. So we had to go to court against the Huntsville City Schools. Now, this was 9 years, 1963 was 9 years after Brown versus Board of Education, which struck down separate but equal, or so we thought. But that didn't mean that Alabama or other places, especially in the South, automatically got in line. It took some brave people, it took some courage, some sacrifice, and court challenges to be able to make things happen. Now, the lawyers for Huntsville City Schools tried everything to keep me out of the school. They had very little to stand on. Like I said, Brown versus Board was 9 years old. But they had a 4-point argument in federal court, why I should not be able to go to the school. Their first point was that such a thing had never been done before. Okay? Of course, the judge dismissed that. Their second point was that there was such a wide street that I would have to cross to get to the. So I guess they were concerned for my safety. I don't know. But the judge asked their lawyers, he said, well, are there white children that have to cross that street? Yes. Are there crossing guards to help those white children? Yes. Can't those same crossing guards help him to cross the street? So they had lost that argument. Their third point was that if they let this one little Negro boy, as they said, go to that school, it would disrupt the entire school system. And the way my father described it, he said, the judge leaned forward and he said, you mean to tell me you have such poor control of your school system that this one little boy could disrupt the entire system? Well, there's no good answer to that question. You can't say yes, you can't say no, right? And their fourth point was that they had turned Montgomery, Alabama upside down and could not find a trace of my birth certificate. So if you think when they tried that with Barack Obama, if you think that was the first time, it was not. Now, I suspect that their lawyers were a little bit embarrassed when our lawyers explained that I was born in East Chicago, Indiana, and they needed to be looking in Indianapolis for that birth certificate. But anyway, the judge, after hearing both sides, ruled from the bench, did not even retire to deliberate. He said, admit this student immediately, and he said, by January 1st, I want to plan on my desk for the desegregation of all Huntsville City and Madison County schools. And so that was the end of that. But that just gives you one example of the challenges that black people faced as far as education. My father, who was born in 1931, never went to a school with adequate facilities. He had to mail order a chemistry set to teach himself about chemistry because his high school just wasn't equipped to do that. He mail ordered a set and taught himself chemistry because he wanted to be a doctor. But again, that's another example of the challenges. Now, as far as housing goes, there was a fairly nice apartment complex in our town that was suspected of discriminating based on race. And so a test was set up. A black gentleman went in late in the morning with a pretty good background, pretty good credentials, pretty good credit history, all of that stuff, and was told that there were no apartments to rent. A white gentleman went in early in the afternoon, and they had 3 places to show him. Very similar background, but they had 3 places. So that's another example of the kinds of challenges that have been faced. As far as employment, my father started his medical career in 1956. He had to practice in a segregated hospital. He was not allowed to use the cafeteria in the hospital. He was not allowed to be a formal member of the staff, and after he petitioned to be added to the hospital staff, he was not allowed to vote on anything at the meetings. And, if I had more time, I could go through a lot of other examples, but you start to get some idea of the way things were. The schools were segregated, of course. The stores were segregated. The public facilities had separate restrooms, separate water fountains, and those kinds of things. But those were the challenges that we faced. Now, fast forward to 1974. I was a junior in high school. I was president-elect of the student body. 1974 was the 20th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, and I was invited to New York City to participate in the NAACP celebration. I met a fellow there named Howard Glickstein, who took the message back to Father Hesburgh that even though I was getting ready to be a senior, I wanted to come to Notre Dame. Well, a week or 2 later, I got a letter from Father Ted inviting me to apply to Notre Dame. So I felt like the skids were adequately greased. I didn't even apply anyplace else, and if I hadn't gotten in, I'm not sure what I would have done after that. But now, if I can fast forward to 2013. Now, 2013 was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and there was a celebration in Washington, D.C. called the March on Washington Film Festival. Thank you. And there I am with Congressman John Lewis, who I think is the greatest living civil rights icon that there is. And I'm very proud of this picture because we were the only two members of the panel on a discussion about race relations then and now. Oh, okay. I thought that was my cue to get off or something. Anyway, race relations then and now. And I had just made a point about Antonin Scalia, who at that point was on the Supreme Court. And this is Congressman Lewis telling me and telling the audience that he had been in California the week before this event. He had tried to make that same point, but hadn't made it as well as I did. So I'm very proud of that picture. And the last thing I want to say is that I know that Father Ted is watching us. When I was in first grade, and I was the only black child in the school, and we had the cafeteria where you have the stack of trays. You take your tray down, slide it along the rail, and so forth. Well, there was a little girl in line next to me. She wasn't quite tall enough to get her tray down, and I got her tray down and went to hand it to her. And she said, "Oh no, my mother told me never to take anything from a nigger." And as you can imagine, that could have been a very, very negative thing. But to me, what I took from that was that she didn't even know what she was saying. And I've taken that with me all these years, that children that young don't know that they should have that kind of bigotry in their hearts. And so I would leave you with the idea, please don't ever be one who spreads or even lets that kind of bigotry go. Please make sure that you eradicate that. And thank you very much for being here.
My suggestion is simply this. All that we cherish at the base of the great dream of America demands a dedication to the dignity of man, the God-given dignity of every human being. And what is the meaning of human dignity in our times and in our nation today? It means this, at the very least, that every human being be given equal opportunity to develop all those human qualities bound up in the wonderful expression of enjoying equal rights to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. And all Americans, whatever their race or color or religion or national origin, be given equal opportunity to participate in the political life of this nation by voting freely, north and south, by holding political office right across the land. That every American have the equality of opportunity to develop all his human talents through all levels of education, because education is the key to tomorrow and to performance.
Please welcome Notre Dame Professor of Africana Studies and Political Science, Diane Pender Hughes.
Good afternoon. Father Hesburgh was an inspiration to many, and I want to spend some time talking to you about two people who helped inspire my own research. In 1977, after I finished working on my dissertation, which was on race and ethnicity in Chicago politics, there might be a few Chicagoans here, I would guess, I decided to turn my attention toward race and ethnicity at the national level. I took a leave from teaching in 81, 82, and headed home to Washington, D.C. to engage in fieldwork to see what black organizations were up to. I had grown up in Southeast Washington in the 1950s in Anacostia, where every day I walked up the hill to elementary school. Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church and school looked out over the city, and you could see much of the nation's capital, including the Pentagon and the Washington Monument. My neighborhood and the city were majority black, but the Congress, dominated by the system of racial supremacy and by Southern politicians, refused to allow political participation by the city's residents. 30 years later, I observed congressional hearings, tracked what organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and others were doing, and met their representatives on the Hill. The Voting Rights Act had been passed in 1965, providing a powerful framework for protecting the right to vote and ensuring that Southern states and jurisdictions could not push back on those reforms. I learned that year on the Hill that a coalition of civil rights interest groups were working together to ensure that the Voting Rights Act, which had to be renewed on a regular basis and was due up in 1982, was strengthened, was renewed and was strengthened. It was and remains a complicated piece of legislation, and as you know, it remains very important even today. But in being there, walking the halls of House and Senate office buildings, visiting the hearings held on the legislation, I met two people whose ideas shaped the debate and marked my thinking for life. This is a Father Ted Said event, and although I didn't know it at the time, Father Hesburgh's influence has shaped the legislative history of the Voting Rights Act. Lonnie Grenier and Frank Parker were two attorneys involved in the legislative campaign to help the Congress think about how the Voting Rights Act might be revised. Both were creative and dynamic thinkers and litigators who pushed the Congress, but who also pushed the Civil Rights Coalition to broaden their protections for Black voters. I spent time observing them, interviewing them in that year and in subsequent years. They taught me and introduced me to the challenges that they faced. Grenier was a NAACP legal defense attorney in charge of their voting rights work. She was a Radcliffe and Yale Law School graduate. She'd grown up in New York City. She was the daughter of a Jewish mother and an academic father. Her father was Ewart Grenier, who was the first chair of African American Studies at Harvard.
Which one?
Pardon me?
Which one was she up there?
This is Rosa Parks on your left, and Lonnie Grenier on your right. Thank you for asking, but yeah, Grenier is on the right. Sorry. So let's see. That's Frank Parker. Grenier was a NAACP legal defense attorney. I mentioned she'd grown up in New York City. Her mother was Jewish. Her father was, let me go back. Her father was the first chair of African American Studies. Parker was older, although not as old as I remember thinking at the time. Funny how that happens. Parker had worked for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights during the years when Father Ted was a member in 1966 to 68. But before Father Ted became a chair, he was chair 69 to 72. After he left the commission, he moved to Mississippi, moved to Jackson, Mississippi, and lived there and worked there for about 15 years as an attorney for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. He prosecuted a range of cases, including those dealing with discrimination in the state of Mississippi. He helped integrate the state police, for example. He prosecuted cases involving discrimination in many different areas of life in Mississippi. For me, they stood out as the most innovative thinkers in the Civil Rights Coalition. Parker, who had worked in Mississippi for almost 15 years, pushed for the concept of majority Black districts in the extension of the legislation, of the voting rights legislation. This was a controversial move. It grew directly from his experience doing field work, doing legal work in the southern states, but especially in Mississippi, where there were large concentrations of Blacks, particularly on the western edge of the state along the Mississippi River, but who were divided, that is, the congressional legislative districts were drawn in such a way that those Black neighborhoods or Black regions were split in order to minimize the possibility that they could elect a Black representative. They intentionally tried to minimize the influence. So Parker pushed the coalition to use Black size as a political resource. In other words, draw a district in a way that brings all of the Black voters together. They followed his guidance, and it was successfully incorporated into the 82 extension. Congress had to support it as well. Senator Dole was part of that coalition, part of the agreement to do that. After the Supreme Court upheld that concept in the early 1980s, a congressional district was drawn to incorporate this Black population. Mike Espy was elected to the 2nd Congressional District in 1987. He was the first Black elected in the state since Reconstruction. Grenier was more flexible as a legal thinker. She supported the concept of majority black districts, but also recognized that this wouldn't be appropriate in all cases, since not all blacks lived in areas that were overwhelmingly black. She emphasized thinking about legislative options to ensure black interests were well represented, even when they weren't in the majority. She promoted the idea of cumulative voting in a case where you might have the same number of votes as there are seats, which gives people the option to distribute their votes in ways that they want. Maybe you concentrate your votes for one person. You can also have multi-member districts rather than single-member districts. These were systems that operated, for example, in the state of Illinois for a number of years in the 20th century. So talking about these people, I wrote this out, presented it, but also realized it wasn't quite as much about their personalities, their liveliness, their commitment to recognition of the need for strengthening the right to vote, their willingness to work, to think, to press for it, to think innovatively. They were really civil rights workers in the Hill, in Congress, in the Civil Rights Coalition, helping those groups think differently about how voting rights might operate. They weren't always successful, but they weren't afraid to try for those changes. Parker stayed in the litigative arena for most of the rest of his career, although he began to teach in the 1990s, first at the District of Columbia School of Law, also at American University, and Washington and Lee University at the time of his death in 1997, when he was about 55. His 1991 book on this work was called Black Votes Count and won multiple awards. Grenier's subsequent years were more volatile. President Clinton nominated her for the position of Assistant Attorney General to lead the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice. But her candidacy was subjected to extensive attacks from her ideas as well as her persona. She was attacked as a supporter of quotas, even though her ideas on cumulative voting and multi-member districts were actually an effort to move away from majority black districts. Clinton withdrew her nomination. Grenier taught at the University of Pennsylvania Law School for a decade and then joined the Harvard Law School in 1998 as the first black woman on their faculty. She published several books, The Tyranny of the Majority, and another, The Miner's Canary, Rethinking Race and Power. She's become less active in recent years. As I understand, she's suffering from Alzheimer's. These were remarkable people whose ideas have shaped my own thinking for some time. At Notre Dame, in my classrooms, in my interactions with students, I talk about their work. I talk about the kinds of approaches they've used to civil rights reform. Those two individuals inspire me today and kind of ground my assumptions about the way in which you think about voting rights politics. Although I didn't recognize it when I first met them in the early 1980s, they were powerful thinkers, extraordinarily hard workers who helped strengthen the foundations for political change. I'm happy to have had the chance to share their legacies with you for Father Ted said. Thank you.
We decided that given that we are a nation of immigrants, anybody who lives in the continental United States has to say that unless he or she is an American Indian, that their grandparents or forebears immigrated into the United States, or they wouldn't be there. So we have to be generous, I think, in our policy. Secondly, we have to be humane because that's the kind of nation we are. Thirdly, we have to be rational because the present system is so complicated and so amended that it becomes almost irrational.
Please welcome Executive Director of the National Immigrant Justice Center, Mary Meg McCarthy, from the class of 1980.
Generous, humane, and rational. Those are the three principles Father Hesper defined so well in this video. Hold those principles in your mind. Hold them in your heart. For decades, those are the principles that guided Father Hesburgh in his work for immigration policy. Decades long of work. At the National Immigrant Justice Center, where I serve as the executive director, for 30 years, we have integrated those principles into our work. In our work representing immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. In our advocacy, we have a unique approach. We see what's happening on the ground, and we use that knowledge to advance systemic reform through litigation, advocacy, and legislative reform. We work with about 1,600 pro bono attorneys, with a staff of 100 individuals, lawyers, and paralegals committed to justice. Our reach is broad, from San Diego to South Bend, with offices in Chicago and Washington, D.C. Today, I'd like to talk to you about how we integrate those three principles. Let's begin with generosity. Generosity is embodied in the 1,600 pro bono attorneys who work tirelessly to represent individuals, from adults to families to children, in immigration court. Many of you may not know, individuals in immigration proceedings do not have a right to legal counsel. Even children, unaccompanied immigrant children, have no one, are alone in a courtroom with a judge and a government prosecutor. These pro bono attorneys give generously of their expertise, of their time, of their skills to ensure a fair day in court. I'm often reminded of Father Ted's generosity and spirit when I see these attorneys. Many of them are Notre Dame grads. In fact, one individual, Leanne Russo, graduated from Notre Dame and has been a pro bono partner working with NIJC for more than 20 years, representing asylum seekers from Mexico to Africa. In fact, in her work, in the work of her firm, Jones Day, they have opened an office in Laredo, Texas, to represent detained individuals who have no access to counsel. They represent women, mothers who've been separated from their children. That firm has been committed to the rule of law. In fact, their managing partner, Steve Brogan, is a Notre Dame graduate and a member of the Board of Trustees. That generosity makes a difference. Leanne has retired as a partner at Jones Day, but continues to represent individuals in seeking asylum. Humanity, humaneness. We have a system right now that we need to figure out how we inject humane treatment. We are depriving individuals of their human rights. Children are being caged, families are being separated, individuals are being denied adequate mental health and medical care when detained, and people are being isolated in remote jails for long periods of time. How do we advance a more humane system? At the National Immigrant Justice Center, we do it on two levels. One, the systemic level, and the other, individual. Systemically, we investigate what is happening, particularly in these jails, whether they're county jails or for-profit prisons. And we expose those human rights violations to educate our elected officials, our policymakers, the public. Father Ted said in the video, we can humanize the system because we're a good country. But what's happened to that sense of humanity, of caring for the other? This is one of our greatest challenges today, opening the hearts and minds of individuals. Two quick stories on how we address this on an individual level. Yvette, a mother of a 3-year-old, fled her home country, traveled miles, thousands of miles, walking, taking buses with a 3-year-old. She was seeking asylum, protection, safety. She arrived at our border. The immigration officers arrested her, and she and her 3-year-old child were placed in a detention facility. The child was sleeping in her arms, and the government official took that 3-year-old child away from her. She was placed in a detention center in Texas, and the child in a shelter in the Midwest. The National Immigrant Justice Center was representing this child, located the mother, and we fought for 8 months to reunite that family. That 3-year-old child, when that mother finally held him in her arms again, was 4 years old. And it was only because of court intervention that that family was reunited. Last week, we had a family who lived in the United States for 15 years. And on Tuesday morning, this family was deported. How did that happen? The daughter was driving her 5-year-old daughter to school. She had DACA. An unmarked car stopped her, and she said to the officer, "What happened?" And the officer said, "We're taking you in. We're part of immigration authorities." She said, "I have DACA." They said, "Too bad. Get in the car." So her 5-year-old child was alone in the car. And she said, "Well, at least I want to take my children to my parents' home to care for her." They got to the family home, the parents' home. The father was walking out. He's a mechanic with his tools in his hand. The mother, the grandmother of the 5-year-old, was in the house in her pajamas. They arrested those parents. We represented that whole family. We filed a motion to stay the deportation. We prevailed with the daughter who had DACA, but the parents were gone. The lack of humanity. They've lived here for 15 years. They owned a home, his tools. They were never able to say goodbye. Rational. We need a system that's rational, as Father Hesburgh said. It's so complicated and so amended that it's almost irrational. And through our work, we try to bring some sense of rationality into the system through legislation, litigation, and public education. We don't need to be detaining people. There's a better way. There are community-based programs that would provide care for these families. I witnessed these 3 principles coming together on a cold winter night in Chicago. The phones were ringing, the text messages were flying, and 1,000 people showed up spontaneously at O'Hare Airport, drawn by the plight and the need of refugees who, because of the executive order travel ban against Muslims, were denied entry into the United States. Some of these people had lawful residency. And suddenly, we saw as a nation the love and respect of individuals who came out and said, and offered their care and demanded what is right. I can imagine Father Hesburgh being outside on that cold winter night in a black coat with Father Ned on his side, welcoming those individuals and providing protection for those in need. The lesson I've learned from Father Hesburgh is that we can't stand on the sidelines when we see injustice. We have to act. We have to make things different. We can make change. Volunteer. Reach out to an immigrant refugee family. If you're a lawyer, volunteer to be a pro bono lawyer. draft letters to the editors, op-eds, accompany an immigrant to court, to their lawyer's office. We can make a difference. Draft letters to the editor or op-eds. We can make the system generous, humane, and rational. And if we don't, who will? Thank you.
And maybe face to face with our extinction, we may wise up enough to start working together for a better world, for a better material ambience, first of all, in which human dignity is possible. It's hard to have human dignity if you're an economic or physical slave, if you don't have enough to eat or drink, if you are cold when it's cold and wet when it's raining because you've got no shelter, when your children have no possible hope for an education, when you never see a doctor from the day you're born to the day you die, and there's no medicine around even if there isn't a doctor, when all of your hope is shriveled up because people are taking the good things of the earth, including intelligence and talent as well as treasure, and spending them mostly on machines of destruction when we might be spending them on education and health and creating a better world.
Please welcome co-founder and executive director of Andean Health and Development, Dr. David Gauss, from the class of 1984.
It's hard to have human dignity when you've never seen a doctor from the day you're born until the day you die. Now, we all know what a great global citizen Father Ted was, but I believe that Father Ted had a special place in his heart for Latin America, and that quotation came from his experiences in South America. So, it's 1997. Father Hesburgh is the co-founder and president of our newly minted organization, Andean Health and Development. I'm in rural Ecuador trying to provide healthcare services with a couple of the great Ecuadorian physicians in a very small, ill-equipped room. And I could almost hear Father Ted saying to me, "David, now do you know what I mean about human dignity?" Why do I say that? So a woman brings in her 9-year-old son who was just bitten by a snake, a very venomous snake. And that boy says to me, "Doc, I'm going to die." I was caught off guard. It's not often that you hear a patient say that to you, let alone a 9-year-old boy. I had training in tropical medicine, and I thought I might be able to handle this. Well, there was no anti-venom at all, anywhere. I had to put the boy in the back of a pickup truck, ship him up to the Capitol because there are no hospitals around. On the way up to the hospital, he died. A 30-year-old man brings in his wife who was pregnant. He's carrying her in his arms. And he says, "Doc, she's pregnant and she was at home and she had a seizure and she hasn't woken up yet. Please help me wake her up." Well, this woman had eclampsia, a major killer of pregnant women all over the globe. And I had to tell her husband that she had already just died. Another boy, about 20 years old, was spraying pesticide out in the fields to keep his plants safe. Now, these are chemicals that, when used in the United States, people wore full body suits, not a single inch of their skin is exposed. Yet this boy was wearing a tank top, shorts, flip-flops, and had a big tank of pesticide on his back and was spraying his crops and walking through the clouds of the pesticide as he was going. He came into our small, ill-equipped clinic. We knew something about this problem, but unfortunately he had something called pulmonary edema where his lungs were starting to fill up with fluid. And we didn't have a way to intubate him or put him on a mechanical ventilator at that time, so we had to ship him up to the Capitol. He got to the big public hospital. The physician that was running the emergency department that night had never seen an organophosphate pesticide toxicity before. So he put the patient off in the corner and went on attending other patients, and an hour later, that young man unfortunately died. A 20-year-old woman came in, had belly pain for 5 days. She was walking around town for 5 days with abdominal pain. No one ever figured out why she never came in to see us until the end, but after 5 days, she came in and she had a board-like abdomen and had appendicitis that had ruptured. We sent her up to the Capitol, and she ultimately died in the Capitol. And so after these experiences, we started thinking to ourselves, you know, we have to do something, we should try and do something about this. Why aren't there any hospitals around here? So I came back to campus, had my usual annual meeting up in Father Ted's office, and Father Ted said, hey, David, it sounds like you're trying to talk yourself into building a hospital. Why don't you build one? And build a big one. When the architects asked me how many volumes of books I want in our library that we built many years ago, they thought maybe 500,000. I said, no, I need 5 million. So build a hospital, and we'll figure out how to raise money for it. So that worked. We built a small 15-bed hospital. Father Ted came down for the inauguration of the hospital. And as I'm sitting there, just about to open the hospital, a completed hospital, I suddenly had a panic attack, and I leaned over and asked Father Ted, hey, Father Ted, I don't know how to run a hospital. and I don't know, how are we going to make this thing, how are we going to pay for this thing, how are we going to make this thing financially self-sustainable? I mean, these are people living on $2 a day, and healthcare services are expensive. And Father Ted looks at me kind of funny and says, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you study business administration at Notre Dame? And I said, yeah. And he said, okay, you got this, go figure it out, you'll figure this out. So then, after another year or two go by, I come back and I tell Father Ted, we're having a hard time finding physicians that can actually work at this place. Most of them come from the Capitol. Our people on the countryside have a different view of health. It's not working. And he said, train them. That sounds like a good idea. So since then, we partnered with the Catholic University in Ecuador, and we've graduated about 80 physicians over the last 10 years, Ecuadorian physicians. So Father Ted pushed us hard to think about how to have an impact on healthcare services to address some of these human indignities that he talks about or talked about. And Father Ted, I really believe, was called and had a much bigger purpose in life that transcended the university. And that he used his position as a university president to tackle national problems and international problems. And so it should come as no surprise to you that after we finished that first hospital, after we got it to financial self-sustainability after 7 years taking care of everybody that comes into the place, after we started training residents, and after we built a second hospital that was about 4 times the size of the first one that the Ecuadorians wanted to call Hesburgh Hospital, it should come as no surprise to you that when I asked Father Ted, where do you think we should go from here? He said, well, when you look around Latin America, are there other places that are doing this kind of work? Is anything you're doing unique? Are there opportunities here for you to share your experiences with people around Ecuador and maybe beyond? And so in the same way that Father Ted, who as university president, an institution that had very little political power, used that political power to address these things and guide it, and used his theology to guide that process. He called on us and he challenged us to go beyond the walls of our hospitals and healthcare system to address policy at a much broader level in Ecuador and beyond. And so because of that, we committed a significant amount of time and energy to begin to publish. And we created our own medical manual. And it's a manual for those of you who are physicians out there. There's a thing called the Washington Manual. Everyone walks around with these things in medical school. That doesn't work in a place like rural Ecuador. There's no contextualization of that kind of a manual. So we wrote our own manual. It's on its 3rd edition right now. We also have a medical journal that comes out every 4 months. All of the authors are Ecuadorian. They're all topics around Ecuadorian healthcare. And both of those things, the manual and the scientific publication, are online. And we get 10,000 visits per month from physicians from 6 or 7 different countries around Latin America. And so I'm going to tell you that I got to say that I now understand what Father Ted was talking about when it comes to healthcare and health in general and human dignity. One of the ugliest manifestations of poverty is to become ill in a failing healthcare system and have nowhere to turn. And so this is a story about a great man, Ted Hesburgh, who instilled in us, a couple of Americans and a lot of Ecuadorians, the courage to begin to address some of these human indignities in a forgotten corner of the planet. Thanks, Father Ted, and thank you.
We all share humanity, whatever our color, whatever our faith, whatever our education. We are all human beings. If one suffers, all should suffer. Man is not an island, as John Donne said. But beyond that, there is that enormous interdependence, that there's a moral independence. If one person, like a Sakharov, suffers the lack of freedom, we ought to all suffer the lack of freedom. There is a continuity in our history and in our relation to each other. And it is, if 100 million people not very far away are hungry, we ought to do something about it. We're capable of it, but instead we are caught up with the foolishness of fighting each other rather than helping each other.
Please welcome Notre Dame Associate Professor of the Practice of Conflict Transformation and Peacebuilding, David Anderson Hooker.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. You heard that I'm a professor of the practice of peace building and conflict transformation, which means that I'm doing the work all the time. And so over the 35 years of my practice, I have primarily focused on conflict transformation, community building, and peace building, where there has been violence or where there still is direct violence, structural violence, cultural violence present. And what I've learned is that primarily the best way to understand people's lives and the best way to understand the systems that regulate people's lives is to understand the stories and the narratives that shape their life. And so I work with groups to help construct and reconstruct stories and narratives of a preferred future. My work has taken me all across, as you can imagine. I've been in Nigeria and Cuba and Zimbabwe and spending a lot of time these days in South Sudan and Somalia. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today is a really exciting piece of peace building that's happening much closer by, in Chicago. I am excited to be a board member of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. Some people, when they're writing it, they'll say CTJC, and I try not to do that. I don't want to abbreviate it because I don't want us to lose track of what we're actually talking about. Chicago Torture Justice Center. Anticipating one of your questions, why would we ever need one of those in Chicago? There's the Marjorie Kovler Center, and there's another center in Minnesota for the support of victims of torture. But those are both centers that address torture that people experienced in other countries, and then they come to the United States seeking asylum and refuge. Just the fact that there are those 2 centers in the Midwest and a dozen other centers around the country that are in high demand suggests that we have to rethink whether and how we close our eyes, close our hearts, and close our borders to people who are seeking asylum and refuge in this country. But this is the Chicago Torture Justice Center. So why would we need one of those? Let me tell you what happened. Between 19 72 and 1991, Commander John Burge and those detectives under his authority used torturous techniques and practices that Burge had learned while he was a military police officer during Operation Phoenix in the Vietnam War. And they used those techniques to extract confessions from people that were then sentenced to prison based on those confessions, and some of them spent 5, 10, as much as 30 years in prison, and there were several that were even sentenced to receive the death penalty under the state of Illinois law. Burge, some of you, let me anticipate one of your questions. One of your questions might be, would these people ever confess if they weren't guilty? I don't know. What I know is that most of us have no earthly idea what we would do if we were locked in isolation, we were being yelled at, we were being beat around our head with phone books, if we were having a shock box attached to our body, that we were having an electric cattle prod stuck in our genital areas, if we were being suffocated, and if we experienced mock execution where there was either a shotgun put in our mouth or a revolver put to our head and the trigger pulled several times. Most of us have no earthly idea what we would do or say to get out of that condition. But it almost doesn't matter whether their confessions were true or false, because it still impacts our personal identity and our national identity. How does it do that? How does it impact our personal identity? What is the narrative that you tell yourself about the country you live in and the role of the rule of law and justice? Most of us think that that narrative is shaped by the founding documents, including the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which would suggest that when torture was used to extract confessions, our national identity was at stake. How so? There were unwarranted searches and seizures as prohibited by the Fourth Amendment. People were denied their right to avoid self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment. They were denied the right to either a jury trial or to confront their accusers as provided by the Sixth Amendment, which obviates the value of a federal jury trial as provided by the Seventh Amendment. They were exposed to cruel and unusual punishment as prohibited by the Eighth Amendment, and because when they were put to jail, they were put in that loophole of the 13th Amendment, which allows enslavement. If you ever get a chance to go back and read, after the comma in the 13th Amendment, it says we abolish slavery except if we can send them to prison, and then they can be forced into uncompensated labor and into conditions of confinement that are equivalent to slavery. My colleague Doug Blackman, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning text, Slavery by Another Name, which was also made into a documentary, and Professor Michelle Alexander both describe this context really well. Anticipating your question, how could this have possibly lasted so long? You said almost 20 years. How could this possibly have lasted so long? Because immediately when this started happening, the mothers, the aunties, the relatives, the friends, social organizations were crying out for relief. So how could it have lasted for 20 years? They experienced what Professor Miranda Fricker would call epistemic injustice. It's like this. Some aspect of your identity makes your testimony less credible, makes your opinion less valuable. It would be if you were a community psychologist hoping to have your opinion valued in a conversation with a group of psychiatrists. You may not necessarily fully appreciate that one, but let me try a different one. It would be if a Stanford alum or a University of Michigan alum was asked to be the commentator for a Notre Dame football game. we tend to not believe what they say. We're going to listen to what they say and be a little suspect. But those are just circumstantial cases where they're experiencing epistemic injustice. The people who are advocating on behalf of these torture victims were experiencing a permanent and durable epistemic injustice. They had limited testimonial authority because they were poor, black, brown-bodied, mostly women who were arguing on behalf of their sons and husbands. They were from the south side of Chicago, and the people that they were advocating on behalf of were not people that most of us admire or concern ourselves with, and so they were allowed, for 20 years, this episode was allowed to continue. That has something to do, or it should have something to do, with our national identity. All of the nuances, details, I can't tell you all of that. So let me just give it to you in broad strokes, very broad strokes. Even when they were protesting, nobody seemed to care. But these are the broad numbers. 20 years of torture, denial, complicity. More than 120 people, at least 120 people that we've been able to get out of prison so far because of torture confessions. 132 million, that's the number of dollars that were spent on the Burge victims of torture. And I emphasize the Burge victims of torture because sometime later there was a report that said that between August of 2004 and June 2015, these same police forces disappeared more than 7,000 people, which means that they were held incommunicado, except for 68 of them, without access to their attorney, for hours, days, months, with no public notice of their whereabouts. But the biggest, the most tragic number in all of this is 0. 0 is the number of people who were held criminally accountable for those actions. Even after the coroner said that there's obviously been torture, even after we charged genocide, Amnesty International, the People's Law Group, all staked claims, 0 people were held accountable. Burge was tried for perjury and obstruction of justice. He spent a few years in prison, but don't worry, if you have a level of empathy for him, I can appreciate that. He got out, retired with a full pension, and was allowed to live comfortably in Florida until he passed sometime last year. So that's the most difficult number. But in May 2015, we finally were able to pass a historic reparations ordinance, and in that ordinance, it provided for the creation of a center to provide specified relief. So it's the first in the country to provide relief to people who have experienced racially motivated violence at the hand of law enforcement. We've also there's a small budget for artistic remembrance and the creation of a curriculum so that this issue and this episode can continue to be taught in schools and it won't be forgotten. So I am proud to be part of an organization that's committed to holding people to account and committed to constructing a narrative where everybody, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, gender conformity, citizenship status, everybody has rights to the relationships, resources, and structures that they need to survive, to thrive, and to manifest their full capabilities. If we lived in such a world already, I submit to you that the abuses that happened at Michigan State and the Ohio State would not have happened, or they would not have extended as long as they did. If we lived in such a world already, I submit to you that the Catholic Church wouldn't be in the pickle that it's in right now. If we lived in such a world, Andean Health, immigrant assistance, and the Chicago Torture Justice Center would be absolutely unnecessary. But we don't live there yet. So this is the thing for you. Most of you will never be victims. Most of you will never be perpetrators of torture. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is that there are 2 positions left. If you're not victim, you're not perpetrator, you're either going to be a bystander or you're going to bear witness. Father Ted said, if we're ever to achieve justice, we have to recognize our moral interconnectedness. Martin King described it as being connected in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Nelson Mandela says that in order to be free, we have to not just cast off our chains, but we have to create conditions in which others are likely to also experience freedom. And even Jesus, on the night that he was about to die, being executed by state authority, while a lot of bystanders stood around, he prayed in his last prayer that we would acknowledge our oneness and that we would live in a way that recognized our connection and our interconnection to the other. I've been trying to anticipate your questions. I wonder if you've been anticipating mine. My question is this: are you willing to organize your life and your life story in a way that bears witness to the possibility of dignity, even liberty, and justice for all? I hope so. Every morning I pray so. Ashe, 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 oh. Thank you.
Wow, that's all I can say. What an incredible group of speakers. My name is Mike Sullivan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association in the class of 1990, and I hope you enjoyed Father Ted Said as much as we enjoyed working with these wonderful speakers. Let's have them out one more time for a round of applause. Father Ted's legacy is an essential part of the Notre Dame experience for all of us. So let's take this opportunity to one more time listen to what Father Ted said.
It's been a wonderful series of years here at Notre Dame since I arrived in 1934. That's a long time ago. I never could have dreamed that first day of class what lay ahead, but that's just as good. Over the years, this university has brought me across oceans and all across the world to meet people who have helped change lives and make a better life for people in far forgotten places. I guess one could say that all of this was working for peace and peace through justice, whether it be civil rights or world development or food for the hungry or peace for those troubled in foreign lands. But especially I'm grateful for what our students continue to do right here. This is the heartland. This is where it all begins. And to be associated with so many wonderful students and later in their lives as alumni, as they try to change the lives of people who are suffering all kinds of inequity around the world. I can't tell you how much good is being done by the Notre Dame alumni, both here and abroad, but it's a wonderful story, and it's a story without end because it goes on yet today. And for all the grace and all of the blessings it entailed, I'd like to say a word of sincere thanks to our Lord and His Blessed Mother, Notre Dame.
And just two final bits of information for you. Please, we'd love your feedback. Fill out the evaluations on this session and all of reunion for us. Helps us to do a better job serving you. And lastly, as Dolly mentioned earlier, the Hesburgh documentary will be screened tonight in DeBartolo Performing Arts Center at 9 o'clock. Here in the auditorium with us right now is the director of the Hesburgh documentary, member of the class of '89, and Dillon Hall, Patrick Creedon. Pat, where are you? There he is. Pat, we want to thank you for the great work you and your team have done in bringing Father Ted's life to the big screen. So we look forward to that tonight at 9 o'clock, and you can begin picking up your tickets at 8 o'clock. So I hope you can all do that. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.